have you all here. And let me just set the stage. This, as you know, is a session in which we will be presenting 6 papers over 3 days, or over 3 sessions, that come out of a special issue of the Journal of Marketing with a cooperation of the Marketing Science Institute. As you may know, every couple of years, the MSI organizes a priorities list. That is to say, they ask their members, corporations, to identify priority issues in marketing. And the last time that was done, we selected 7 of the priorities and developed teams of academics to write papers. So it's a great idea, I think, to have collaboration between the members of MSI and the academics. But there's an additional twist that I think will add some liveliness to this session, and that is that we've also asked, once the papers were written, we've asked practitioners to comment on the papers. And we will be presenting in these sessions, in today's session, 2 papers, and in this later today, another 2, and tomorrow another 2. We'll be presenting the academics and one of the commentators. And then we'll invite you to discuss the results, the conversation. So yeah, I think this is a great idea because it permits our ideas to be tested, for us to get our ideas, first of all, from practice, but then also to have our ideas tested by people in practice. So we have a lot of conversations in academia, but they tend to be among academics. And this is a chance to have a conversation that includes people who practice what we do. And I think we'll learn a lot from that. So Matt, could you just turn to the next slide? So the first session, which runs from now until 9:30, is as you see, Consumers and AI, an Experiential Perspective. And we'll take 15 minutes to present it. I believe Markus and Simona will present it. And then Ken Cukier from The Economist will have 15 minutes to comment on the paper. And then you, the audience, will have 15 minutes to discuss anything you like to discuss emerging from either the paper or the commentary. And the presenters are welcome to debate and comment themselves. So that's a free-for-all. And since we're not in person, there's no danger. So let me, of people coming to blows, because I think in this session particularly, there's an edge to the perspective of the presenters that I hope will emerge. So with that, I believe I hand over to Simona, who needs no introduction, but if she does, Simona is at the London Business School, where she's speaking to us from London. So take over, Simona. Great to see you.
Okay, so the division of labor is that Simona is doing the slides. I'm the one who is doing the first half of the presentation. So good morning. Hello, everyone from Toronto. This is Markus Giesler from the Schulich School of Business. I would like to begin by thanking both Chris Moorman and John Dayton for all the wonderful things that they have done to help us with our scholarship, with our paper. We're the team that focuses on consumer AI, artificial intelligence, that is consumer facing, how consumers experience it. My esteemed co-authors on this project are Stefano Pontoni from Erasmus, Rebecca, who's with us today, Rebecca Walker-Retchek from Ohio State, and Simona Botti from LBS. So let's dive right in. Next slide, please. The focus of our paper is really on consumer-facing artificial intelligence. You know, artificial intelligence and algorithms that we find in consumer-facing products, services, and experiences in the marketplace. Here are a couple of examples, and obviously, you know, as you have a look at them, you might find that many of those products are products that you actually have in your home right now that you're using on a daily basis. There's a fair bit of excitement at the moment on the side of industry and also, of course, on the side of those who participate in the intellectual debate around consumer-facing artificial intelligence, that it solves a lot of problems. And I think the starting point for us is that we wholeheartedly agree that, you know, I think we can be sufficiently optimistic around the impact of these technologies on our everyday life. As our critic and commentator Kenneth Cukier, who, if he has arrived by now, I also want to welcome, has argued these products and these services are amazing because for the majority of consumers, they actually work pretty well. And this is pretty much the starting point for our critical investigation of consumer AI, because our starting point or argument is that it's not enough to say that something doesn't require additional scrutiny only because it works well for the majority of consumers. It turns out, next slide please, that we need to, first of all, as good sort of behavioral researchers in consumers and consumption, need to distinguish between the capabilities that artificial intelligence might have, of which there are 4, listening, predicting, producing, and interacting, on the one hand, and the experiences that consumers might have around or with those capabilities on the other hand. So the research question that we're asking is, how do these AI capabilities influence the consumer experience, and might they influence the consumer experience differentially? In other words, do some groups of consumers have a better time with those consumer AI solutions than others? And if so, what is it that we as marketers can do? What is it that we as marketing scholars can do to sort of even out the playing field and make the landscape of consumer AI as inclusive and as sort of identity enhancing for all consumers that are out there? Next slide, please. What we found is that when we began our conversation around the more critical sort of perspective around consumer AI and how that experience might actually not be as sort of fulfilling and as effective for some groups of consumers than others, we found that there's already a fair bit of scholarship out there that has looked critically at consumer AI. This is scholarship that's not necessarily been done by consumer researchers, but it's been done by sociologists and sort of cultural anthropologists that have focused on asking the question of how do these AI capabilities influence consumer experience. When we sort of take the capabilities that I've just outlined, listening, predicting, producing, and interacting, it's fair to say that for each of those capabilities, there's already a fair bit of scholarship available that talks about how these capabilities not only drive and shape a consumer experience, but also constrain the consumer experience for certain, let's call them vulnerable populations, groups of consumers that for, sociological reasons or demographic reasons or reasons pertaining to their specific subject position might not have the same experience as the majority of consumers. So for instance, there has been great work by Shoshana Zuboff on what she calls the age of surveillance capitalism, where she talks about how sort of the so-called data exhaust that is produced by sort of Google's system or Google's infrastructure then became sort of a valuable kind of marketplace in its own right, and how this has led to sort of privacy concerns for certain groups of consumers, and a kind of marketplace in which surveillance is an issue, and that surveillance affects consumers differentially depending on their subject position. Likewise, there's been work on transhumanism by Saskia Sesson. She has talked a lot about how, automation and the influx of artificial intelligence and algorithms into various domains of work has led to, certain groups of consumers or certain groups of members in society to feel excluded and to feel sort of, no longer needed, no longer sort of to be members of the productive class, if you will. So these existing conversations that already have been outlined by other scholars were very helpful for our purposes, because the next question that we then ask is, given that there's already this critical perspective on each of those 4 experiences, how will it influence consumers on the micro level of analysis? And to explicate that, I would like to hand it over to Simona, and she will take us through the 4 different experiences and how there are tensions for consumers in each of them. I'm not sure if Simona.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, for some. Oh, okay. Sorry. Congratulations. All right. Can you hear me, right? Because I get like weird sounds. All right. So the first experience that we're going to we analyze is the data capture experience that is based on the listening capability of the AI. You can think about like maybe a continuum of situations. So the first one is the situation in which, or on one extreme of the continuum, the situation in which the consumer is willing to share their data and knows with a high certainty how the data is going to be collected and managed and used. And on the other side of the continuum, there is maybe a situation in which the consumer is not entirely sure that is actually providing data to the AI, and is the AI kind of shadowing the daily activities of the consumers and capturing data this way. For example, the case of Roomba, we know that they can create maps of the different living spaces. This apparently is Markus' living space. To me, looks like the Versailles, castle. I'm used to much smaller spaces, flats in London. But anyway, so this data capturing experience, of course, as Markus says, gives a lot of value and can provide a lot of value to the consumers, because through the capturing of the data, the AI can provide highly customized, highly personalized experiences, very often for free and at no cost for the consumer. The consumer doesn't have to put the emotional and cognitive effort into defining these experiences. On the other hand, though, as Markus also mentioned, there are societal costs and this idea of this surveillance society that is alluded at. But from a psychological perspective, there is a cost of perceived loss of control. So consumers do not perceive to have the ownership of their data any longer, their personal data, and therefore may feel not in control of their life. We know that loss in control from a psychological perspective is a negative state. It creates negative affect up to helplessness and demotivation, and can also create what is called psychological reactance, so hostile reactions and negative evaluation of the sources they are perceived as threatening the control of the individual. The second experience, we call it classification experience, is based on the predicting capability of the AI. It's kind of similar to the previous one, and it's a situation in which through the AI can give personalized recommendation and suggestion to the consumer. In order to do so, the AI uses not only individual data, but also contextual data and data from other consumers. So you may all have seen something like this, in which, based on your choices, you're told like other consumers similar to you do the same choices. So therefore, the perception from the consumer perspective can be of being classified in a certain group of people or classified as a certain type of consumers. Now, this classification, again, can be valuable because we know from psychology that belonging to a group, especially if that group is considered like an aspirational group or as a positive attitude towards the group, is good from a psychological perspective, because it can affirm the self, and again, it can be aspirational. Now, I'm not sure whether academics is like an aspirational group, but like pretend that they are an aspirational group. On the other side, though, sociologically, as Markus said, can create this type of perception of an unequal world he alluded to. But from a psychological perspective, the cause can be of the consumers feeling incorrectly classified into a group. Maybe because this classification is based on a past self. Maybe because this classification is perceived as based on only a narrow view of the self. To the extreme, this classification can be discriminatory. So the consumers can be classified in certain groups, and these groups can perpetuate bias, prediction, bias behavior. The third experience, we call it the delegation experience, and it's based on the producing capability of the AI. And this is a situation in which the AI takes on some of the tasks in a production process that otherwise they would be, carried on by the consumer themselves. Now, again, what is the value of this? Well, of course, there's a lot of value because the consumer can decide to carry on those tasks that, they like more, or they're more satisfactory, or they're more meaningful, or they're better at, and leave other tasks to the AI. So the consumer can feel empowered by using and doing only those tasks that are better for themselves. On the other side, though, we have this idea of the feeling of being replaced at the societal level has been studied as this idea of the transhumanism. At the individual level, can be seen as loss of efficacy. By self-efficacy, we mean this sense that we have the skills and the capabilities to master the environment and to produce desired outcomes, and the ability of attributing to ourselves these desired outcomes. Like a control, a loss of self-efficacy is similar to a loss of control in that is very damaging from a psychological perspective, and more objectively can lead also to the objective lack of these skills. So individuals can decide, or consumers can decide, to just satisfy and apply themselves to those skills and capabilities, but they can decide not to nurture these skills and capabilities because they know that the AI would do that for themselves. The last experience is the social experience. It's based on the ability of interactive communication of the AI. And here we focus only on the interaction, the communication between the consumer and the AI in consumption experience. So what is the value? Well, when everything goes well and the interaction is smooth, then this is great because the consumer can interact with the company with a mediation of the AI in a beautiful way, right? It can be more efficient, it can be more effective, it can be even more democratic than having the real people that you can interact with the customer service people. So there is better connection within the consumer and the company through the AI. However, here two things can go badly, and Markus talked a bit about this idea of the humanization of the AI. From the consumer perspective, is actually the opposite, called the complementary side, that the consumer can feel dehumanized with or during an interaction with the AI that is not as smooth and as efficient and effective. So we can all think about situations in which we feel frustrated because the chat box or the bot doesn't really respond to what we want, doesn't really get back, doesn't really treat us as human, it doesn't have the flexibility that we want from the other side. But here too, at the extreme level, we can think about certain types of consumers being less able to have this effective communication with the AI. And so this type of world and this type of mediated communication has been reinforcing or exacerbating existing barriers and existing social inequalities. Yes, and this, given with all this analysis, we ended up having some managerial recommendations. I'll go very quickly, but overall, what we recommend is that, first of all, it's important to learn, to know that there are these costs, to know what is the value that the AI is providing, but also to keep in mind that there are potential costs at the physiological level and at the psychological level that should be taken into consideration by the organization, either alone, so with an internal type of soul searching, but even better with creating of a network that includes external entities, so other organizations, public policymakers, academics, and not only academics in marketing, analytics, and computer science, but other disciplines like humanities, like data privacy, in order to learn what these costs are, to understand the role of the company in shaping these costs, creating these costs, and also how to intervene. And in terms of intervention, we went in the paper over each one of these experiences, and we gave some potential suggestions for how to design these experiences, taking into consideration these costs and limiting these costs. So, for example, for the data capture experience, we talk about using the choice architecture principles to present the various data options, the various data capture options, so that consumers may understand better what is it that they are agreeing on and how the data is going to be used. For the classification experience, instead of giving predictions and suggestions and recommendations that are like specific for the type of consumers, the AI can actively give recommendations that is for a different type of consumers. So in order to kind of burst the bubble and force the consumer to think in a different way than maybe they would think. For the delegation experience, to include elements in the design of the experience that can reduce or limit this perception of being out of control and in loss of personal and self-efficacy. And finally, for the social experience, you think about ways in which the AI can make the relationship between and the interaction between the consumer and the company effective and efficient, but also maybe the interaction between consumers and human equally efficient and effective. Back to Markus.
Splendid. Thank you, Simona. So how to go from here? Again, just to recap, our starting point was to ask the question of how the four different AI experiences, the four different AI capabilities that have been identified by prior scholarship influence the consumer experience. We have been able in our paper, and next slide please, to identify these four different experiences, and I think that matters because these four experiences provide categories that future researchers as well as practitioners can use to get their head around how AI really influences consumers, consumer identities, consumer choices on the experiential level. What we also found is that, to speak with Arthur C. Clarke, any sufficiently advanced technology is not always indistinguishable from magic. AI can do magical things, it can do wonderful things, and maybe even it works super wonderfully for the majority of consumers out there. And yet, I think we should be mindful about the fact that because of the ways in which technology is not politically neutral, but actually helping to kind of maybe in some cases perpetuate existing inequalities and also running the risk to undermine the democratic process, that we need to look at how AI works and operates differentially for different types of consumers and different groups of consumers. And that is the frontier of scholarship that we're trying to push hard against. And so we are coming up, and we don't have time to go through all of them, with over 40 questions that future researchers in this domain can hopefully take to heart. One quick footnote comment that I want to make is that I am really excited and grateful for this collaboration in particular because it is one where we had a diverse team of experts and co-authors. We had 3 psychologists with different sort of emphases and areas of expertise, and 1 consumer culture theorist. And I think that means that, one learning for me personally, and I think my co-authors will agree with me, is in order to tackle those challenges, the differential aspects of how consumer AI is experienced across the different types of groups of consumers requires interdisciplinary research teams and requires dedication and focus on these 4 different experiences. And each of those experiences comes with its own set of research questions that we encourage you to kind of look at as you hopefully download the paper after our presentation and have a look at them.